There's a lot of really cool things you can do online to present things in interactive ways. None of that's really that new. And when I look back, I'm actually kind of surprised at how little so much of this has changed. The purpose of this in the organizations I'm in is like start a conversation. And so things that could improve that, I find really intriguing, whether it's, kind of the promise of all this personalization that we always talk about, but I still never seen work. That could get good. That would be amazing. There are people out there that can really benefit from this stuff. And there can be topics that are incredibly narrow and you would never want to do in a broad way, but that could be super useful and worth the effort if you could figure out a way to get to people.
Our latest Everything Thought Leadership interview was with Tom Fleming. Tom is Director of Global Thought Leadership at PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC, as the $53 billion global advisory and accounting firm is known. In this interview, Tom talked about the activities that he is involved in at PwC. Tom also talked about the key factors in publishing great thought leadership content, the biggest changes he's seen in his career, the key changes he expects to see in the thought leadership profession over the rest of this decade, and his advice for people who are new to the thought leadership profession and want to excel in helping experts become widely known for their expertise. Tom, great to have you on our show. We will ask a bunch of questions, but it's a real pleasure to have you because you've had a long and illustrious career in thought leadership.
That sounds really strange to hear. Thank you. Like, am I that old? How did that happen? Well, thank you, Bob.
So let's start with, where you exist in this giant firm known as PwC. Yeah. Tell us where what you do exists within the giant.
That's a great question. I'm not even sure I know the answer to that. The place is gigantic. So I've been at PwC for a couple of years now, and PwC is extraordinary. Like all the big four, it's a really territory-led place. All the different country offices are independent companies that are part of a big network. So you've got like the bigger territories like the US or the UK, they've got their own everything. They've got their own marketing units, content people, distribution people, web people. And so I'm in this thing called the GMO, which is the Global Marketing Organization. It has been around a few years, not a ton of time, but it's been around a little while to try to bring the whole thing together to be a kind of a bit of a voice for lots of territories that don't have resources. To be able to put out content and do things that kind of have a global feel and lots of territories can benefit from. And so, we're kind of in that central office sort of role, which is an interesting and odd place to be sometimes.
And you're heavily involved in strategy and business, the publication?
Correct.
And that was started, of course, from the old Booz & Company, which PwC acquired back about 10 years ago, I think.
That's right. And then the core of it, it's like the core of the GMO, like the GMO editors, the folks that were there when I started and have kept the fire burning, are like the folks that came in through the acquisition or were acquired. And so they were the core of editorially for Strategy and Business magazine, which had been around for about 25 years before we took it digital about 18 months or 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But that was where that all kind of came from.
Now, you've been at McKinsey and you were involved at McKinsey Quarterly and so now at PwC, Strategy and Business. How important, from those two experiences, how important do you think it is to have this well-known flagship publication? Strategy and Business, and I don't know if it's still the case today, was a newsstand publication back when Joel Kurtzman launched the publication.
It doesn't hurt. It's a good thing to be known for something. We are no longer on the newsstand. That's a change that we made a couple of years ago. The advertising model, it's time to try something else. We've gone all digital and have tried, and we can talk more about what we replaced it with. But there's something nice in a big professional services organization. If you've got some brand value to this thing you're doing internally, it helps because people recognize and respect what you do. You don't as much have to describe what you're doing from scratch every single conversation, although you sometimes do. And it's great to be around people where there's a legacy of trying to do something thoughtful and in a regular fashion. So it's and then people do see it from the outside. There's a value to it. It takes a long time to build these things up.
So do you get many more people who want to publish articles in Strategy and Business than there are the number of articles that actually end up?
Hopefully. I mean, this is like, you want to, yes, in a governance kind of mindset. It's great to be in a place in a firm where you have some decision rights over what you publish so you can kind of help shape things and get things where you want. But absolutely, we have people reaching out to us that want to get things on the site and in the digital edition and things more than we usually have room for. Although with the web, it's not easy like it was with print to say, well, we just don't have space.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That excuse can't be used anymore.
Not as much.
So let's go back to your career, actually, even before you joined McKinsey in 1995. Almost 30 years, though. Next year will be 30 years you joined McKinsey. What did you do? What was your background?
In 1995, I was finishing up an MFA in fiction writing. And I was working as a process server and investigator in Tucson, Arizona. I'm from Arizona originally. So as far away from this kind of stuff as you could imagine, I would guess. And when I came over after grad school, moved to Chicago with my wife, McKinsey was hiring. I didn't even know who they were. And I yelled at by my father-in-law for not understanding how cool it was to have an interview with these guys. And what they were doing at the time was they wanted people to create client presentations. And there was this really brief window, like this magical period of time when they didn't want like crack designers. They wanted people that were sort of editorial like, and that could kind of, call BS on a bad chart or bad data, or kind of have a dialogue with the consultants, but also blast out, charts, make things quickly and be flexible. And they did that for a little while. Then they realized we don't want that. We want really good designers. And so but by then I was already there. And so that was really how I started at McKinsey and did that for 5 years. And then that chart experience, suddenly I got the attention, again, happenstance, in Chicago with the new publisher, Stuart Flack, who'd taken it over, based in Chicago. And they were looking for someone to edit their charts. They hadn't had anybody that did that before. So here I was, and I got the gig, and that was how I started it out.
So would it be fair to say that you were in the field of data visualization before there was a field called data visual?
Yeah. We called it infographics. We didn't know what to call it. It was data visualization. I mean, people were calling it that a little bit, but my first title, I was an infographics editor because that's the closest we could come up with.
And it certainly was not interactive graphics, interactive data, was it?
We did a couple, like it was kind of like, like a Spruce Goose flight, like a really short. We did a couple simple interactives in 2001 or so that were whatever the technology would let us do, that we would just, because it was fun and we could see that there'd be a lot of opportunity there. But yeah, it was very limited.
How did you jump over to the, I'm going to edit articles now? I'm no longer just editing and helping them figure out how to nothing. I'm going to get my claws into the articles themselves. How did you
kind of accidentally, like the way these things work? We were talking about format innovation, different things we might do. And one of the things you've always get these in professional services, you get these massive reports or PowerPoint packs from like a constituency. It's a practice, it's an office. In this case, it was like the India office, and they had this big study on India's economic prospects. And we were like, we should make like a little simple print thing that's like a chart with a couple hundred words. And while everyone was kind of talking about, well, what should that be? Should it be this? Should it be that? I just sent the editor I was working with, do you mean like this? And I just did it. And he kind of looked at it and said, yeah, this is what I meant. And then he called me and said, do you like this? The word part of this? And I was like, sure. So really went from there. Just started working closer with him as a mentor. The rest is history, I guess.
And that enabled you to really kind of get to the heart of somebody's thinking, and not just some visual, some chart or whatever, to help that person or a bunch of authors with some piece of their thinking, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the beginning of all this. It's like even when you're making charts for consultants, you're trying to break through with really time-starved people to give them some message that's clear and useful and as sophisticated as it needs to be, and then have it be a story if you can. I mean, it's people. We're human beings. We crave storytelling. So it was really just kind of marrying those two things together. But that even sounds more highfalutin than it is. It's just like a killer chart and a couple sensible paragraphs that explain it. And that's really what all the audience at that time really wanted.
Yeah. Now, when you joined McKinsey in 95, they had the quarterly. That had been around 1964, so that was around for 31 years. But had they done as much on the website with McKinsey Quarterly or not by the time you got
No,
there?
they were just starting it. They were just starting it. The whole server, like the whole site was on a server in a closet, like a floor above me. It was an amazing time to be with this team. It was a really small team. And, we were kind of putting all the content, putting things on the site, from the archives and all that kind of work to get going and actually have a presence and then start the distribution mechanism, which was all, just alert based. What do you tell us when you want to read about X? And that was a big innovation at the time because those lists over time built up to be massive.
And I remember at that time, because was in thought leadership for 8 years by 1995. I remember the only way to get the McKinsey Quarterly was to get the print version, and somebody from McKinsey had to say so and so can get the quarterly. And then when McKinsey went online, it was open to anybody, of course. When you look back at your 19 years, those 19 years at McKinsey when you rose to executive editor, how did moving from a print to a print plus online, but particularly an online publication, what were the biggest changes that you saw?
And we did an interstitial, like in between all that, we had an era where we actually sold it did like a bundled thing where we sold the print issue and provided like premium access, did that for several years. It's funny because the two channels are so different and have different, sort of audiences in a way that even having the material be free and blasted out in that era when that really started, the print version still had a lot of exclusivity to it and was still very highly demanded. So it really didn't, it didn't cannibalize, it didn't devalue print. If anything, it made it arguably more powerful for a little while, I think. And getting the material out to people online and having it be this sort of alert-based approach broadened the audience hugely. Lots and lots of people that had never heard of it suddenly had access to it and were getting some benefit from it. So I thought it really helped. And there was a period in between all that where we actually had a paywall and premium content, and they actually were selling the print issue as a perk.
But then they gave that up for whatever reason, which is what they couldn't get enough pay.
No, it wasn't that. There was a strategic decision that it should be free. We'll get more power out of this if we make it freely available to everybody. I mean, in my head, and I don't know that this is like the orthodox version of how everything went down, but it seemed like, from about the time I joined and when the guy that was running it at the time, Stuart Flack, the push was to like professionalize the whole thing and really, really kind of make it like a publishing engine. It had been sort of, it had kind of ebbed and flowed before. And if you look way back in the history, it was more of a reprint vehicle. So there was this, in my mind, it was like this big push to professionalize, show it was valuable, charge money for it, show people it's got a real value to it. And then all the time it's still generating client conversations, which is really what it's for. Then the move online and making it free and everything just felt like an extension of that to get it to more people.
Yeah. So you left McKinsey and you went to Heidrick and you were there for about 3.5 years.
Yeah.
And did they practice thought leadership and content much differently than McKinsey? Or
no, I mean, so I got tempted away, and the temptation was to try to build something. They weren't doing thought leadership terribly. They were kind of hit or miss, and they hadn't really put a lot of investment into it. And so that was like almost like a little startup inside of a company that was established and doing smart things and had a lot of good people and a lot of good content, a lot of good unpublished, unexplored content streams. And that there, the thrill was just like, let's see what we can do and build it up. It was really good fun. A good friend of mine is still running it, Jocelyn Simpson, who took it over after I left and got tempted back to McKinsey again.
Yeah. And they have a new CEO at Heidrick, as you might know, Tom Monahan, who ran corporate executive board for many years and helped make it a $1 billion organization that it became before Gartner bought it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he's impressive. I have never met him, but certainly know who he is.
Then you went back to McKinsey in 2018 and you were deputy editor-in-chief of the Quarterly, McKinsey Quarterly, and you stayed 3.5 years. Then you joined PwC in early 2022. as Director of Global Thought Leadership. So what do those responsibilities involve?
That's a good question too, because again, like most of these roles, these things change a lot. In every professional services environment I've been in, all three of them now, I guess one, two times, these roles change every few years. So my role at PwC and getting tempted over, I followed a mentor over, is, we've got this sort of limited thematic portfolio, and we're trying to really kind of do content at a high level and kind of, and there's some change elements going on as well. I think it's fair to say.
I guess one of the questions I had here is, at McKinsey, you've got the Global Institute, right? You got a research engine, right? And they have editors assigned to it. Then you have the editors working for the quarterly, and those editors embedded in the various practices.
Sure.
Does PwC have a research think tank, kind of like Global Institute, or is it more kind of, ex-journalists talking to PwC consultants,
trying to drag it out of their heads? Yeah, it's a little bit of all of that. It's like, and I guess I'd go back and say, like, one of the things that I thought was always really great about McKinsey was that you don't get elected partner unless you're contributing to the firm's knowledge. So when you have that kind of mojo going on, you can really, it creates a foundation where, like, think tanks and things like that can get spun up and then stay, because these things are like, they're expensive, they're cumbersome, they're hard to staff. Not necessarily the editorial people, but like if you're trying to bring in consultants to get fresh ideas and stuff. So PwC, to my knowledge, doesn't have that sort of incentive in place. So it's a little more challenging. But that said, we do have a couple big groups out there, and there's a lot, really, because the place is so, to kind of territory specific. There's a global thought leadership accelerator that we work really closely with, very small group inside of PwC advisory that does some great research. Lang Davison, who is also a colleague of mine at McKinsey, he runs that. And we work really closely with them because they've got really good insights that they're ginning up, and we've got editorial capacity and the distribution channels and all that good stuff. And there's, like, the Katzenbach Center, which is an organizational excellence kind of a hub inside of PwC that does good work, which is, again, left over from the booze days. But we don't have, like, kind of one big, and then there's things on the tax side and the advisory side. There's like institutes and things, and there's a trust institute, which is quite interesting. And we will dip into some of these, but there isn't like one, there isn't like one above all. There's a whole bunch of them.
So let's turn to strategy and business and the digital renovation, the digital metamorphosis that it's been undergoing in the last couple of years. Tell us about that. Why was it done, and what were the big things, the big goals?
No, it's a weird position for me to be in, because being from a print environment for years and years and years, to show up right at the time when we were kind of doing our last print magazines was odd, to say the least. But the move to digital is just a necessity. The model is it's not only just more economically, obviously efficient, but we can extend our reach. We can bring the strategy and business brand as it is closer to the PwC brand in a way that might make sense to readers externally and internally, importantly, because when you get these massive companies and they make an acquisition, it's easy to kind of, which part's that? What does that mean? And so it helped kind of bring the brands closer together.
Strategy and Business was launched in 1995 by Joel Kurtzman, a one-time editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review. Kurtzman is credited with coining the term thought leader. Now, Strategy and Business began as a quarterly print journal, and it had newsstand distribution and advertising. Joel Kurtzman left Booz in 1999 to join PwC. However, Strategy and Business remained at Booz until the firm was acquired by PwC in 2013. Kurtzman passed away in 2016 at age 68, but his vision for strategy and business, and for the field of thought leadership in general, lives on to this day.
And it lets us be maybe a little quicker to market and in formats that are just more engaging. And so the idea being, this digital edition, we put it out about every month, and It's meant to be, super approachable, super engaging, not terribly long, very kind of clickable and data rich. You get you get a message, you get some good thinking out of it. It also provides on ramps to other stuff. It's not entirely just a tease. You get a full story there. And it's got digital elements and bells and whistles and videos and quizzes and fun things. I mean, it's easy when you're doing this work. It's easy to kind of get kind of in your own little world and think about how important all these things are you're doing. And it's like we're getting paid to read this stuff, and our audience is not. So trying to find ways to make the stuff fun, why not? Plus, it's more fun to work on. So that was really the big push to get the team. Whole team came together to kind of reimagine what we might do to make something that was kind of approachable, a little more bite-sized, and really interactive and engaging. And that's kind of how it all started.
And what's been the impact since in terms of views or however you measure, impact?
It's great. I've got all my cheat sheets and my post-its on the wall that you can't see, but the numbers have been really good and growing. I don't have them handy. I'll tell you that right now. It's like, what's the result of all this been? I think that externally, let me think how I'd answer this. What have the results been? Because it's been successful, but it's also important to think about that success in this environment that we're in, where it's really hard for anything to get attention right now. Anything, anywhere, no matter how good it is. So our numbers are good, everything's growing, and we've got good reader engagement, and it's helping contribute to client conversations, starting client conversations. That's what this is all about. At the same time, internally, it's probably helped to raise the profile of the work that we're doing as a group, because it showcases this. These issues are collections of content that bring together several pieces on a theme and sample them in a way that tells a different story. So it lets us give love to lots of content, not just one thing. That's a powerful thing internally.
Do you have a favorite article or two that you actually want to put up on the screen? Walk us through it.
Give me a minute. Give me a minute. It's like having like your kids. Which one's your favorite? And it's like you can't answer that question.
So walk us through this. I was looking through this before our conversation.
Sure.
I found this pretty intriguing. So walk us through this. What we're looking at and how you design.
What are we doing? Yeah. And also there's this sort of an effective walk us through some game you're playing, which is always kind of a weird experience. Like, and then you click here and this happens. But no, this whole issue is based on some research that we did in the CEO survey, which comes out every year. It's a statement thing that PwC does, probably the biggest CEO survey out there. It comes out in January. And one of the findings was on sludge, organizational gunk, the things that slow down everything we do. And we had a bunch of data from CEOs on what they thought the state of play was. And we connected that to work that our, kind of workforce colleagues thinking on how do you address it and what are the upsides, and because not all sludge is bad, right? It's like having some friction when there's like stupid decisions about to get made actually is a good thing. So we have Bob Sutton in here. We have an external voice, but basically what you have is you just have a digital, the snapshot of some findings, what people are seeing out there in terms of the problem itself. You've got different, kind of clickable ways to kind of get some simple prescriptions that you're going to get more of later. Then you've got an in-depth section, and you kind of on it goes. And there's findings and charts and data viz. One of the really fun things in this was one of our data researchers, this brilliant guy in Australia. Like they did all this research on a couple questions in the survey were like, specifically for CEOs, how much of your time is inefficient on these different tasks? And then he took that, and he and the team kind of figured out a way to kind of convert that to money and time based on a whole bunch of assumptions, and from that you can then extrapolate and say, well, go ahead and reverse engineer it, make a quiz out of it. So you basically, with this sort of like assumptions that are baked into it from the CEO survey about what CEOs think, you get this little sludge tax calculator where you say, okay, so let's do it for you, Bob. So like if you had to say in a typical week, the time you spend on work meetings that's inefficient is like what?
Oh, I'd say 50% of meetings are inefficient.
Yeah. So you also have a very small company, so that's alarming. And then on emails.
Oh, 20%.
Okay. Okay. And then everything else, like things like timesheets, text troubleshooting.
Oh, 60%.
60. Good grief. Okay.
I'm a micromanager. That's the problem.
It doesn't have yeah, actually that is part of the problem. Depending on how you're doing it, you could be creating a lot of sludge. And it's funny, the thing fills up as the poor executive is drowned. And then like in terms of your number of employees, what's the range?
1 to 9. We have 3 and a bunch of independent contractors.
There you go. So you 30 grand a year, 250 hours wasted. Well, unproductive time. It's not really waste. But then the opportunity cost part is the fun part that one of our editors came up with. That's a couple hundred, 250 yoga classes. It's massive guitar lessons, 500 mindfulness sessions, and then nearly 15,000 pages of good reading you could have done. So
I love it. It makes it personal. It's like,
yeah, it's kind of fun. I mean, it's this stuff doesn't all have to be boring, right? But yeah, it's a fun way to give people an engaging way through content. But then there's some, thinking at the bottom around how do you kind of think through how to deal with all this. There's the Bob Sutton, link out to the Bob Sutton book where he talks about a whole mess of things around friction, including the good kind and how you deal with that. And in his typically colorful way, it's good stuff. But yeah, so part of this whole issue is it brings together stuff from PwC. Of course, that's who's paying us, but then also a little bit of external thinking to round it out.
I think it's great. I love that article, and I had looked at it before our conversation, but I love it. What percent of your articles do you give this kind of treatment? Is it all the articles that you publish, or just maybe it's 20%?
Yeah, it's a smaller group. It's a smaller amount. I mean, it's part of it is we're trying to be focused on certain kind of core thematic areas, right? So we're trying to kind of not just do anything that we could do, but then again, these are going to be the things, the pieces that are behind something like that digital issue are going to be premium things that you're trying to really put a lot of effort against. But you might bring a little something in from somewhere else that wouldn't warrant that kind of treatment normally, and give it a little bit of love, something like this, because it's a compilation of sorts.
Yeah.
We have other formats to try to doll up big traditional reports and make them more digitally friendly. We have a leadership agenda site that an editor colleague of mine runs that takes snapshots of things, killer charts, and little simple 200-worders with a little bit of advice that tries to kind of make things digitally friendly. So we try to pick and choose. Part of it's what does the firm want to be known for, and part of it's what do we think executives need to know.
Yeah, I love that. I love this stuff. Let's take a step back and look at your career in thought leadership, and look at the biggest challenges you've seen over time in those 3 companies, McKinsey, PwC, Heidrick. The biggest challenges in consistently publishing high quality.
It's strange. I mean, I was thinking about this because it shouldn't be hard. It's like, but it is. And I think part of the reason it's hard to consistently aspire to and publish quality stuff is because in these professional services environments, it's like the tide comes in, the tide comes out. You have new people coming in all the time. The organism is sort of constantly refreshing and bringing in new people. And those new people are brilliant and they're really motivated and they don't know what the hell you're doing. You have to kind of start from scratch and then you're in really these conversations with people that are incredibly busy, and they're at an airport or they're driving in a rental car in a tunnel, and you've only got a couple minutes. So you end up having to kind of reinforce these things again and again. You can't ever nothing's for free. You can't just like establish it. Now they all know. And you can't put it on a web page somewhere and say, well, we told you what you have to do. It's like, it doesn't work. No one has time for that. So the environment's constantly changing. You're constantly fighting against all the things that are out there, whether it's just busy people, intellectual vanity, all the things that you're trying to kind of, feel your way through. And then from there, it's hard to do. I mean, quality stuff is hard. It takes more work. It takes more work. It takes more engagement from the authors. They can't mail it in. They've got to really roll up their sleeves, and it's hard for them. It takes time. And a lot of times they're doing it out of hide. It would be a lot easier if we just kind of said this was good enough.
And they're not getting compensated by giving you their time, right?
They are, but they don't know it. If it works perfectly, it's like you kind of have this social contract with them. Like it's going to feel a little painful. It won't really be, but you'll kind of tell yourself this was a pain, and then it's going to be really worth it because you're going to get some call from someone that you weren't expecting, and you're going to get someone who invites you to speak at a conference. So they're going to, kind of just want to talk to you about the thing you did because they want to do the same thing at their company. It's like, and then you've got a convert for life because they see that it works and that the pain was worth it.
When they get the client feedback or they open a door that wasn't open before at a new client and you see what this stuff can do,
Early on, it was like the people that I was working with were like, they were all externalists, and it was all very much like, this kind of the sanctity of the smart thinking and good ideas. But then like this little voice that like, don't forget, we're all marketers. This is like, all we were trying to do is start client conversations. That's the beginning and the end of this. If you can do that, keep the lights on.
Yeah. And what I've told people is until you see it personally work, until you see thought leadership actually produce a conversation that you never expected would happen, you don't understand how valuable it is until you personally experience this.
It can help. Yeah, it is tough because you want to be able to scale it and do things and be able to convince somebody that has never experienced it that it's a smart thing to invest in. But to some extent, when somebody sees it work personally, they're a believer for life.
They're a believer. Okay, so the next question here is about the most consequential changes you've seen in how leadership content is presented online. So this new incarnation of strategy in business is an example of that. What are the biggest changes you've seen, and where do you see it going in terms of content presentation over the rest of this decade?
Boy, it's funny because if I look back and try to think, there's a lot of really cool things you can do online to present things in interactive ways. None of that's really that new. And when I look back, I'm actually kind of surprised at how little so much of this has changed. Behind all of these really smart presentations of digitally friendly, approachable material are like lots of teams that want to write really long articles, and everything ends up being like, a 3,000 word article if you're lucky, and can be much longer. So I'm kind of struck by how little change there's been in some ways, or how the kind of forces against kind of innovation or content format innovation have always been there. But then again, there's always these little pockets around the edges, or some places that just do really good work and they just raise the bar for everybody. And so in terms of specific innovations and things, it's like all the things people have seen. I don't have any, I see what everybody else sees. It's just like content that I find. Do you find it interesting? Do you want to click on it? Do you want to read further? Simple stuff.
Where would you like to see it go over the rest of this decade?
I'm really it's like I'm kind of a caveman about the purpose of this in the organizations I'm in is like start a conversation. And so things that could improve that, I find really intriguing, whether it's, the kind of the promise of all this personalization that we always talk about, but I still never seen work. That could get good. That would be amazing. There are people out there that can really benefit from this stuff. And there can be topics that are incredibly narrow and kind of you would never want to do in a broad way, but that could be super useful and worth the effort if you could figure out a way to get to people. So that's kind of intriguing. I think AI, boy, where to start? That's gonna change everything. Yeah, I'll just leave it there for the moment.
So for people who are new to this great profession of thought leadership that you've been in for years and I've been in for more years, I'm older than you. What's your advice to people who are maybe just entering the profession or been in it a couple of years or are thinking of entering the profession? Yeah. What do you think outlook will be? And what would you do now if you were given what you know about this profession, what would you do now if you were starting out?
Boy, I would have done my homework more to find out what McKinsey was so that I wouldn't have gotten slapped around by my father-in-law when I was applying for the job. I didn't even know what they were. I thought they were a law firm. But I think that like in terms of where it's going, I think obviously AI and everything to do with AI is important to understand and see how it's going to develop. But some of the changes I see coming that I would want to be more thoughtful about if I was just getting into this would be around whether it's zero-click search or what this could mean for the way that we try to distribute all this content. I think there's going to be a lot of changes. But at heart, it's like this stuff is still about storytelling. It's just trying to make something complicated simpler and more easy to understand and fun where you can, engaging where you can. So that's really the place to start. All the business, understanding what business people are up to and doing, and having the business cred and business chops is really, really important. I find that people that do really well in these roles, they can teach you how to write really well. You can learn to be a better writer, but you're not going to learn to be a better thinker unless you really focus on it. You're not going to, the business experience and what people are really doing. But like, at least for professional services, when I looked back and thought about how, when I started shifting from the chart side of things and making graphics for presentations and everything to the content, the typing words, ideas, paragraphs part of this, I was getting this promotion. I was in this meeting, but I didn't really know it at the time. And the guys that were telling me this, the publisher and my manager at the time, who was a former HBR editor and a really good guy and a mentor as well, he's like giving me all this advice, and I'm writing it down on a Post-it, and I've still got it, and it's got coffee stains and everything, and I put it in a little thing so I wouldn't get it damaged. It's like my little magic Post-it. And the advice that he gave me, and he probably had more than like 3 things, and I probably forgot to write them down, but it's like the things that I wrote down in terms of like you as an editor and how you approach the role. Your power is your integrity. Like that's where you get this from. Which over time I've come to see, it's easy to cave. It's easy to let something slide, let a shitty example in. But it's, if you have that integrity to be able to back up and really push for quality work over time, it's going to help you a lot. And then the other one was,
even when you get back, where somebody says to you, Tom, I'm not going to think anymore on this point that you think is nebulous. I'm done thinking.
You got to pick your spots. But yeah, there's times when you got to think about how there's a million different approaches to like, how do you deal with that conversation? And there's some ways that work better than others. And there's sometimes when you just, if this is it, you got to put your foot down. And then there's plenty of times when you can defer it and catch the author again when they're not as cranky and they haven't been on 50 calls in a row and long flights and all the rest of it. But yeah, you got to pick your spots. But if you cave, if all you do is cave and all you do is polish up whatever they tell you, you're on a really bad path. Your life might be easier in some ways, but it's not a good career move.
And so what were the other things?
So the other one was around like how you prioritize your time. And it was really like just pick high impact things and help get wins. And I think it's like when you start doing this work and people start to see that it helps and it works and you get a little bit of a fan base and, Sally tells Joe, people call and want to do articles, latent demand is suddenly there. It's easy to kind of get spread too thin and do things that aren't impactful. And so you have to figure out how to focus on things that are going to get wins and meaningful wins. And whether that's for the author and kind of a particular situation or more likely a practice or kind of, you got 3 things you could do. Which one is really going to be better for the firm and the practice you may be working with. So you got to be selective.
How does somebody make that, especially a young person of 25 years old, 35 years old? That's young to me. How does that person make that decision of, I'm really going to focus on this team rather than that team that's been hitting me harder? How do you figure out which horse to bet on?
In my experience, you try not to be the person who's seen to be deciding which horses win and lose. It's like you try to figure out a way in the kinds of organizations that I've been working in, try to find a way to spread that decision making in a sensible, get the biggest, smallest group that can help you make those calls together. Maybe that's creating an editorial board within a practice. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a steer co. They go by many names, right? But it's not just like you and your magic thought leadership wand kind of saying what's good and not, because you're not going to make any friends that way. You're going to alienate people. Help make that decision get made in a smarter way. So it's not just you being a bad guy. It's a practice leader helping you figure out which of these 3 horses to ride and why.
You don't want to be judge and jury, basically. You don't want to be that person who is the chief rejecter or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you don't make any friends calling the baby ugly is kind of the phrase that I've heard. And so it's a tricky balance because you kind of have to have that integrity to know what's good and not and be able to steer it in the right direction.
Yeah.
But you don't want to look like you're kind of imperiously making these decisions because you don't always have all the information. There's something you didn't know that there's a way to make that piece way better, engaging with a practice or a bigger group.
And unless you do that, make that decision in a team is what I'm hearing you saying. Unless you have a team to make that decision, you're likely to say, there's no chance with this article. It's just, I don't see it going anywhere. So, but somebody else on the team may say, well, actually, if he or she took it this way, or they took it that way, there might be something really good here.
Could be, or it's just like, hey, this is a great idea, but there's no evidence at all. It's just a bunch of air. And they say, well, actually, talk to so-and-so. They've actually done some work in this area. And then suddenly you're bringing, now you have a co-author, and now you have a smarter article, and now it's actually going to work, something that you wouldn't have had before. So it drives some people crazy. And if you've got a temperament where you want to do it all yourself, don't even do this work, at least in a professional services environment, because you will go crazy.
So the mentor, going back to what your mentor said and that you wrote on it.
Yeah.
So integrity. The second thing was kind of pick your spots,
get wins, the high impact stuff. The third was we were just been talking about, which is just in these environments, it's always a good idea to syndicate and shine a light on it. Get things kind of seen by bigger groups. That works at kind of every level. It works if you're trying to get a group to make a content decision and have skin in the game, right? It's like if they have to think about it, then suddenly they're going to be more excited and supportive of the final product. But then at the same time, even if you're just out there and you don't have that luxury of having some kind of board set up that you're kind of part of, you still see that two things are completely related and should be combined because you were so focused on serving the one need that you didn't look up and realize there's more out there if you'd only asked. So it's easy to get too myopic with this stuff.
So somebody who's a team player, it seems to me what you're saying, and I believe this, somebody who's a team player is going to function much better in these roles than somebody who's a very talented editor, very talented writer, very talented thinker, but doesn't play well with the folks around them.
Boy, I mean, you've just described the failure mode of amazingly talented journalists that come into this kind of work and just burn out like a comet across the sky kind of thing, where I've seen situations where these incredible people that are really smart and excellent writers and thinkers just can't deal with it because the whole consensus driven thing and all these different groups that want to make decisions and all the sludge, it drives them crazy and they can't stand it and they can't suffer fools. And, and I've seen that be a failure mode where you take that kind of lack of collaboration to an extreme, and you have every other skill that would make you brilliant at the job, but you can't work. You can't work there because it just won't happen.
I understand that because being a former journalist, it's not a team sport in most cases. Journalism is not a team sport.
I remember talking to a former business journalist, because most of my mentors, all my mentors were these amazing grizzled business journalists who had these great stories and great experience, but they'd all figured out a way to make it work in a professional services environment. And I remember talking to one of them, and he was just kind of marveling over drinks about how you work on a story, and when you're doing this at Reuters, you work on a story and you're done, you submit it, and you have a drink, and then. But here, you submit your story, you have a drink, you look up, and there it is again. The next day, and it comes back again, and it's been 2 months and it's back. It's like you gotta get used to that.
Or longer. I've seen longer, right?
We've all seen longer.
I've seen 12 months.
Yeah,
and I don't like to talk about that.
One of the coolest things we did at Hydric was over a year. It ended up being awesome, and it probably needed to take at least 6 of those 12 months, but the rest of it, no.
Some things are not ready to come out of the oven.
No. Well, and sometimes it wasn't our oven. Talking about who you're trying to publish things with externally, and it doesn't, if you're not in charge of the oven, you know how that is.
Tom Fleming is the thought leadership professional who's at the top of the thought leadership game. The biggest things I took out of our interview are the value of having key mentors at different stages of your career, the need to experiment with new ways to present thought leadership content, especially interactive ways. What also struck me was when Tom said, at the end of the day, this is all about storytelling, about taking a complicated issue and simplifying that issue, and then making it fun for the audience to learn, to engage with. And lastly, the 3 things that Tom learned from a very important mentor years ago that he wrote down on a Post-it note: having the integrity to push for higher quality ideas, prioritizing who you work with in your company, so that you focus on people who have the potential for game-changing ideas, and being a team player. All stars who don't play well with others don't go very far in the thought leadership profession. Thank you for watching episode number 34 of Everything Thought Leadership. We have more great interviews ahead in the coming months. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a like and if you shared the episode with your colleagues. Everything Thought Leadership is a video and podcast series from Buday TLP. It's for thought leaders and thought leadership professionals, the people who help experts get recognized as thought leaders. You can find out more about Buday Thought Leadership Partners at budaytlp.com.